Well, hello again. Back with Mel. I'm here in United States. Mel is over there in Europe, and we're talking thousands of miles away, and yet here we are. It looks like we're in the same room right next to each other. This is the beauty, amazing thing about technology. And I bring Mel in every once in a while because he has such great research. He's going and he's trying to look and find out this character in the 7th century and in the 8th century up until the 9th century, this character of concerning the Ilyas out of Tayaya. We've talked about Ilyas quite a few times now. I think you all know who we're referring to. He's from much further north up into what is today Iraq, that he was a king, he was an authority, but he also had more going for him. And it looks like what Mel has found is there is a view of this guy, this fellow who himself considered himself to be possibly a precursor to this Messiah who's going to come later, something like what Elijah was, a Elijah figure. And so I'm going to bring Mel on board because he's going to show us that much like everything else we've looked at, when the Islam that is put together here in the 9th and 10th century from the Abbasid area, this Islam that is now up in Baghdad, by that time it has moved to Baghdad, but it's 200 to 300 years later, the character of Muhammad they put up here, it has some antecedents that really did happen, but he's not the Muhammad here. He's another Muhammad on this side. And yet they needed to give him body. They needed to give him a history. They needed to give him a place and also some background. And so they borrowed from this guy, and they borrowed a lot more than they intended. And this is what Mel's going to show us. He's going to show that there are enough, we now know enough about this fellow, this character, Ilyas from Tayaya, that seems to suggest that they took it, even his reference as to what his job was, what was his mission, his ministry in life. Looks like these people back here have even brought that into the picture. Great stuff. And this is what we love to do. Now, remember, these are white papers. These are what if scenarios these look like. And I'm going to let Mel to say where on his gradation of his categories this lies. And he may say that not everything is monolithic. There might be different gradations for different parts of the story. So, Mel, are you there?
Yeah, I am, Jane, and thanks for welcoming me back. So just to introduce this, people may have heard about the Messiah complex. I'm going to introduce the idea that Muhammad had an Elijah complex. I don't know if this term has ever been used before.
No, you're coining it right now. This is the first time other people can borrow it, and then you can be credited for it. Much like we're finding Islam borrowing everything and then taking credit for itself. No, in this case, let's go ahead and say that one of the Melvilisms, or we'll call it the Melisms, for the future will be the Elijah complex.
Absolutely. So there's two aspects of this that Islam has tried to forget. One is there's prophecies connected with Muhammad that didn't come true, and the Islamic tradition is designed to hide this failure on Muhammad's behalf. And there's also something funny about his real name that Muslims would rather not know about. And this fundamentally undermines the whole Islamic tradition. So we're going for the nuclear today. Okay, so let's a big thing today. So let me just share the screen. Tell me if you can see this.
Yeah, there it is. So thank you.
Okay, so our title today is Muhammad, the man with the Elijah complex. So, now, just to put this into context, I'll go over the categorization that I'm using before I explain why I've given it a 4 here. So a 0 would be something which is like a conspiracy theory or a wild idea without any fact-checking done. A 1 would be where I'm fishing or pondering an idea and just thinking out loud. A 2 is for a deeper probe with some corroborating evidence. A 3 would be a credible hypothesis. A 4 is a workable theory, so it's got quite a lot of evidence to back it up. A 5 would be a slam dunk, a theory with multiple sources that is clearly proving the case. So this is where we're at. Now, an early source paints Muhammad as the eschatological warm-up act, not as the headliner, as the Islamic tradition would later present him as. The Doctrina Jacobi is a 7th century Greek Christian polemical tract set in Carthage in 634, but written in Palestine sometime between 634 and 640. So if you look next to Antioch, this is where it was written, but way over on the western side in Carthage, this is where it's said to have taken place, if that makes sense, which is in Sycamina, which is in
people today,
Palestine.
just so where people understand today, Antioch would be modern Turkey, the southern part of modern Turkey, and Carthage over on the left would be modern Tunisia, or the city of what is today Tunis. So people will know where you're talking about for in today's geography.
Yeah. So if we draw from the source itself, he was proclaiming the advent of the Messiah according to this really early source. So it's quite interesting. This is very different from the Islamic tradition here. So quoting directly, and they were saying that the prophet had appeared coming with the Saracens, and that he was proclaiming the advent of the anointed one, the Christ who was to come. I having arrived at Sycamina in Israel, stopped by a certain old man well versed in scriptures, and I said to him, "What can you tell me about the prophet who has appeared with the Saracens?" He replied, groaning deeply, "He is false, for the prophets do not come armed with a sword. Truly they are works of anarchy being committed today, and I fear that the first Christ to come, whom the Christians worship, was the one sent by God, and we instead are preparing to receive the Antichrist. Indeed, Isaiah said that the Jews would retain a perverted and hardened heart until all the earth should be devastated. But you go, Master Abraham, and find out about the prophet who has appeared." So I, Abraham, inquired and heard from those who had met him that there was no truth to be found in the so-called prophet, only the shedding of men's blood. He says also that he has the keys of paradise, which is incredible. And it's interesting that the fact that he mentions that he replied groaning deeply, and even at the end says, which is incredible. So this idea that this guy was a prophet was treated with utter incredulity, particularly the idea of a prophet coming with a sword. Now, if we just draw from that then, the end is nigh is a very common theme in the Quran. The Quran's eschatological urgency that judgment day, the hour, was soon to be upon them, is part of this common doomsday culture that was prevalent at the time. Muhammad's Jewish hearers would have associated this with the advent of the Messiah. Stephen J. Shoemaker, in The Death of a Prophet, page 28-29, argues that due to the prophetic depiction of Muhammad in the Secrets of Rabbi Shimon ben Yohei, a Jewish apocalypse written in the mid-8th century, it likely incorporated only lightly edited material from an older Jewish apocalypse written during the first decade of the Arab conquest. This states that God raises up over them a prophet according to his will and will conquer the land for them. So if we just go back for a moment, the key thing that is being suggested by this early source is that this Muhammad was proclaiming the advent of the Anointed One. In other words, he is just the warm-up act. He is basically saying that the Messiah will soon come and will come straight after him. So in other words, he's claiming that the Messiah would come and that the world was soon to end. Now, making such a prophecy and such a claim was really bold because it can easily be disproven. And it was disproven simply because the world continued to exist, and we're now 14 centuries later. So his claims that the Anointed One was about to come has been proven to be false. And obviously this is not something that the Islamic tradition particularly wants to remember. They remember other things about what this Muhammad or Ilyas was talking about, but they obviously have covered up this part, which is embarrassing. Now, what's interesting is the Jewish impression of this guy is that he was crazy and possessed. This seems to be a very early assessment of him. So by people who were contemporaries of this Ilyas. And again, this is from page 30 of Stephen Shoemaker's book. A fragment preserving the opening section of the Secrets of Rabbi Shimon survives among the Cairo Geniza texts, and according to this version, which is slightly different to the one I've just read, it says, he, being God, he raises over them a crazy prophet possessed by a spirit, and he conquers the land for them being the Jews. What do you make of that, Jay?
Well, crazy, possessed, and conquering seem to fit perfectly.
Yeah, and it's not a good impression of Muhammad. This is from people who saw him, so he doesn't look like he's in the full, he's in his full senses. He seems to be perhaps fanatical. Maybe he was possessed. We don't know, but they don't take him as just a regular, normal human being here.
When you look at the traditions, which is fascinating, of when he was receiving revelation, wahi, it's called wahi in Arabic, is inspiration is coming upon him. In almost every case, you can see that, number one, he hears the sound of bells, he hears the buzzing of bees, he froths at the mouth, he has these fits, these look like epileptic fits. He falls to the ground. People would try to hold him down. It takes 6 people to hold him down. He has so much strength, and he screams and has enormous headaches. What does this sound to you? Like someone who is possessed by an evil spirit.
Absolutely, yeah.
Quite crazy, I would suggest. So even the traditions have taken and still incorporated that part of it.
Yeah.
And people have always said to me, doesn't this show that this is an argument from embarrassment? Why would they incorporate these two? Well, to remember, back in those days in the 9th century, especially in the 9th century, a kahin would be a storyteller, somebody who is like a griot that we have in West Africa. They would have to manifest something to prove their authority. And many of these manifestations in that part of the world, especially up in northern part of Iraq, were just these. These are the manifestations that show that you were receiving a revelation, that you were receiving something that is supernatural. Today, we see that as demon possession, or we see that as schizophrenia, or we see it all kinds of difficulty, mental problems. But not back then. Not back then. Everybody who has received a revelation should manifest these kind of manifestation. Now, by doing that, the Jews looking upon him see him as crazy, possessed, and of course he is well known that he conquered the land. That was one thing. That was one of his jobs. From their perspective, they got it right. They got it correct. But from an Islamic perspective, you can see why they would incorporate these type of references to his character, or odd references to his character.
You know, from a Christian perspective, it is not a total surprise to find a source like this saying that he possessed by, like, if you were to think of an event that was so key to, if you like, the devil's mission. And this would be it, because if you think about it, because of the advent of Islam, Christianity lost 50% of its lands, 50% of its adherents. It was one of the most colossal assaults on the Christian faith that's ever been since the time of Jesus. So this makes perfect sense to me, from that point of view.
Yeah, and I would suggest that also, since in the Arab world, that was something that was seen as honorable, that was something that's seen as credible, and also something that would give this person authority, they would push these manifestations as from their perspective, whereas Christians would say, no, this is what a crazy person would do. This is what a possessed person would do. So you can see 2 different cultures are clashing at this point, possibly because of these manifestations.
Absolutely. So on page 120 then, Shoemaker says, from the beginnings of Western study of Islam, scholars have generally recognized the importance of the hour in Muhammad's preaching. The coming judgment is the second most common theme of the Quran, preceded only by the call to monotheism. So why is it such a big theme? It probably suggests that this was a core part of Muhammad's teaching. Not that I'm suggesting that the Quran was written by Muhammad, but something from that tradition seemed to have come into the Quran. Paul Casanova asserts that both the Quran and the Hadith reveal a pressing belief in the imminent end of the world, in Muhammad and his followers. So again, this idea that there was a strong belief that the world was about to end in this early tradition, and the obviously the world didn't end, so they swept this out of the tradition later. Now, I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but I'm going to just move on.
Go ahead. That makes sense.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I'm going to bring in a source now. This is from Isho Yab III of Adiana bin, who died in 659. He's an East Syrian source. He definitely was in the know, becoming, as Robert Hoyland says, becoming a bishop of Nineveh in the 620s, metropolitan of Arbela by 640, and then Catholicos, head of the Nestorian Church from 649 until his death in 659. So he is right there, right in the right place at the right time from the 620s onwards. He's in Tayaye country, and he's not divorced from what was going on the ground, because being a leader in his church, he would have been hearing reports from all over the land. So he would be very familiar with what was going on in those decades. So a very key source. Now, in terms of this source, though, despite the fact that he's a good witness, I'm giving this a 1 in terms of what I'm going to draw from this. There is possibly something in this, but this is quite speculative. He doesn't mention Muhammad. He doesn't mention Ilyas. He refers to someone called the One. And so rather than suggesting this is definitely Muhammad he's talking about, I'm going to step back from it and say this is possibly who he's talking about.
Well, thanks for doing this, Mel. And just for those of you who aren't aware of what he's talking about, number 1 in the gray there, it means it's nothing more than that he's fishing, he's pondering, possibly. He doesn't have any conclusive. And you're being honest by doing that, because the other material that you looked at earlier is a number 4, which is a workable theory, because you have solidification and falsification, and that the ambiguity is not nearly as much as speculative as what you're doing now with number 1. So you're saying, be careful. Let's just put it out there. Let's see, for those of you who are listening, whether or not you do accept this or not. It's open to question. You're being honest about that. Appreciate that.
Yep, no problem. Okay, so this is the source. As I said, it is not certain who he is obliquely referring to as the One, but Ilyas or Muhammad would fit the bill. And just before I read this, I suppose, just to use a more recent example of this scenario that this bishop is faced with. The bishops in Poland back in the 1950s and 1960s faced a similar problem living under communism. They had to be really careful whenever they gave a homily or a speech or a sermon, in case they're overheard or their sermon is interpreted as a criticism of the communist regime. So if they tried to criticize the communists, they would have to couch it in very careful language so as not to give them a reason to be arrested. So this is a similar situation in the 7th century. We have what is, from my perspective at least, a very strongly totalitarian regime that has taken over many countries. And so therefore the Christian leaders have to be incredibly careful. They also need to encourage their followers. They need to, make sure that the Christians don't lose hope and are not overly fearful. And they're trying to give them a boost and say, things are not that bad. Don't lose heart. So this is the context of this quote. I hope I've made it clear. So here's what he says. He says, "For the One who has seduced you and uprooted your churches was first seen among us in the region of Redan, where the pagans, Hanpe, are more numerous than the Christians. Yet, due to the praiseworthy conduct of the Christians, the pagans were not led astray by him. Rather, he was driven out from there in disgrace. Not only did he not uproot the churches, but he himself was extirpated. However, your region of Persia received him, pagans and Christians, and he did with them as he willed, the pagans consenting and obedient, the Christians inactive and silent." So obviously, he's not mentioned Muhammad by name, he's not mentioned Ilyas, but I would suggest, considering the historical context, who else could he be talking about? I would suggest that this is the person he's referring. What would you say at this point, Jay? Do you
Well, I
think
mean,
it's...
I would agree with you. I mean, this is something that you and I have talked about in the past. You always have to be careful. We've mentioned this before. I mean, you look at your name, Mel. Why is it you don't give us your name? Because you cannot dare give us your name with what you're saying. You would have repercussions not only to your career, but even to your person. And that's why you don't say where you live. You don't say who you are. We do that even today. Unfortunately, those of us who criticize Islam have to hide who we are. I'm one of the few ones who doesn't hide because I've been doing it for so long. In this case, it looks like much the same thing is happening here. He's not going to say exactly who he's talking about. He's just referring to the one. Yet when you look and see what he's saying about him, he seduced you, uprooted your churches. Look at that. You're going to talk about the region of Radan, where that is, and in a place where the pagans are more numerous than where Christians. I mean, this is all fits the historical scenario that we're talking about. So I would say, yes, you are being speculative. You're being very careful. You're not saying this has to be Muhammad, but it looks like it could be Ilyas. It could be the Ilyas of Tayyaya that he's referring to. It fits the man, the place, also the environment and the time.
Particularly considering, he was a bishop in the Tayyaya lands, so it kind of fits that this is who he would be aware of, who he would know. So, to give you an idea where Radan is, this is where I believe Radan is. It's spelled in different ways, as you can see. If you look at the list at the top, you can see that the third option there, Radan, is the same spelling as in the source. And currently, it's a village in Isfahan province in Iran. So if you were to go westward from Radan, where that dot is, you would actually land in Tayyaya lands. So those blue lines running down that grayish land is actually the Tigris and the Euphrates. So, it is conceivable that Ilyas crossed into those lands on his preaching missions. Unfortunately, we don't have a year in terms of when he's referring to. So this could be any time. It's hard to say. But
if he died in 659, so this is just before Muawiyah comes to power. This is in the era that Muslims like to call the time of the rightly guided caliphs. According to the traditions, they would have taken all this land. This would be under their control because by the time this bishop dies, they have control from Tripoli in the west all the way to Afghanistan in the east. So this would be well under their control. Now that's what they say, and they give the names Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. We can't find any reference to those names. What we do know is that these are the Arabs. They do control it, and they would have control of Radan. They would have control of Iran. That's within that swath of land. So if this is this character that is, seducing the people and conquering the lands, that would make sense that you've got the right man at the right place doing the right thing at the right time.
Yeah. No, this is a continuation of the same source. And what's interesting, it actually contextually, this backs up the idea that it could be Muhammad because of the fact that he's referring to the Arabs and the conquest of the Arabs. So again, this would support this idea. He says, as for the Arabs to whom God has at this time given rule over the world, you know well how they act towards us. I would suggest take a lot of what he's saying with a pinch of salt, considering his situation. Not only do they not oppose Christianity, but they praise our faith, honor the priests and saints of our Lord, and give aid to the churches and monasteries. Why then do your, I'll be careful how I say this, Murwinaye, I think that's how you might pronounce it. So why then do your Murwinani reject their faith on a pretext of theirs? And this when the Murwinani themselves admit that the Arabs have not compelled them to abandon their faith, but only asked them to give up half of their possessions in order to keep their faith. Obviously a clear reference to the jizya there. Yet they forsook their faith, which is forever, and retained half of their wealth, which is for a short time. Now, just before we go into a bit further, the Murwinaye, it's unclear who is being referred to. These are a group of Nestorians, but there's a confusion. Are they the people of Merv? Or is this a reference to the Maronites? We don't know exactly, but I suppose it's not key. But you can see there, he's talking about that while the Arabs didn't force them to abandon their faith. They are encouraging them with a 50% tax, essentially. They have to give up 50% of their possessions if they want to remain as Christians. And obviously, a lot of the Christians were leaving the faith. And this is obviously is quite alarming to the bishop. And he's trying to say, hey, it's not so bad. 50%, what's 50%? You know?
So is he being facetious here, is what you're saying? Are you saying he's being sarcastic?
Yes, yeah. He's trying to, what we would say in Ireland, he's trying to plumose them, which means he's basically trying to gently encourage them to resist. But he's studiously avoiding criticizing the Arabs directly. But if you read between the lines, he's obviously criticizing them. But he's saying, like, they praise our faith, honor our priests and saints, and they are aiding our churches and monasteries. Well, if they're taxing the adherents to Christianity, asking them to give half of their possessions, then clearly they're not honoring those people. They are not aiding the churches. They're doing the opposite. So if you read between the lines, you can see what's really going on. That, you know, he has to say nice things about them, but in reality, their faith has been destroyed by these Arabs. So now, you know, just to further what I'm saying is, Isho Yab is not safe to openly criticize his overlords. We can understand why he doesn't name the one who has seduced the people. It would be likely highly dangerous to do so under the totalitarian regime that prevailed. We ought to take it with a pinch of salt, his praise for how well the Maghreb treat Christians, especially when he admits they only asked them to give up half of their possessions, i.e. the jizya. This was likely said to reassure his own Nestorian adherents at a time of great uncertainty.
So this is typical of when you're under duress. When you're under duress, you have to be very careful how you be critical. And in some ways, he's using irony, sarcasm, to hide the fact that they are under duress. So this is something you would understand coming from your part of the world, because irony is almost a pastime there in the UK and that part of the world. It's fascinating how you are masters of irony. You can pick up on this much quicker than other people can. Absolutely,
yeah. No, sarcasm is part and parcel of communication in Britain and Ireland. You know, it's part of what you do, and it's a very nuanced thing, but you can detect it from a mile away. And this is clearly,
you guys can detect it. We in America, it tends to go over our heads. We forget a lot of the times when we're looking at your humor. Most Americans I know don't understand British humor because of that. And yet it's brilliant. If you live there where I did for 25 years, I picked up on it and saw it and understand it. In fact, that's how you can see it so much clearer here. This is what's going on here. In this case, the 7th century.
Yep. Okay. Now I'm going to move on to another area, and we're going to be looking at we're going to be looking at Ilyas's name, and this is, I'm really looking forward to sharing this because it's going to be quite fun, I think. So just drawing your attention to the Latin phrase "nomen est omen," the name is a sign. This is something I'm quite interested in. We spoke about my name earlier on and the meaning of the name, and this is kind of connected with that in a sense. Nominative determinism is the hypothesis that people tend to gravitate towards areas of work that fit their names. Essentially, people draw meaning from their names, and thus their names become self-fulfilling. So, Jay, if we take your surname, for example, Smith, you know, you've been hammering the heretics for decades. You know?
So that's what you do with my name. I'm a smithy. I'm supposed to be smithing, hammering away at different pieces of metal. I'm hammering away at criticism. Okay, I'll run with that. That's the first time anybody's ever tried to impose that on me. God bless you. Okay, but this is so nominative determinism. You take on and you do what your name suggests, is what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like a subconscious thing. You fulfill the meaning behind the name. So you're not conscious of it, but it kind of leads you, it gives you a suggestion. And then once you do some particular vocation in life, it kind of makes sense, and it kind of gives you a sense of you've achieved who you really are. So one
Well,
explanation
I should be a little bird then, because I'm a jaybird. Jaybird is a little bird that just flits and floats and does all kinds of things. Be careful. I hope I'm not my knowledge of determinism doesn't impose that upon me.
So maybe that's the reason for your colorful shirts, Jay. Maybe. So one explanation for nominative determinism is implicit egotism, which states that humans have an unconscious preference for things they associate with themselves. So there have been a number of funny examples of this psychological phenomenon, and I'm sure our audience will enjoy some of these. So there was a book on polar explorations by Daniel Snowman. These are all absolutely true. There's an article on urology by researchers named Splat and Whedon, which I think is my personal favorite. The psychologist Carl Jung cited as an example Sigmund Freud, who studied pleasure and whose surname means joy. So that was an interesting fulfillment. A study of American dental rolls showed a significant correlation between men called dentists and men becoming dentists, which is strange. Igor Judge is the real name of a former Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, who clearly was a judge as well. And sorry, this might be a little bit rude, but Thomas Cropper was the inventor of the toilet.
Yeah, that one I've heard. That's a well-known one. Well done.
Yeah. And so other funny examples, a neuroscientist called Lord Brain, a firefighter called McBurney, a cashier called Kaching.
Kaching.
Andrew Drinkwater, he was a worker in the Water Research Centre. There's a physician called Dr. Doctor, an ophthalmologist called Ashley Seawright, a gastroenterologist called Dr. Joshua Butt, a music teacher called Miss C. Sharp, a chef called Tim Kitchen, and a weather presenter called Amy Freeze. You know, so these are
sweet.
Some hilarious examples of people fulfilling their names in very real ways. This one, I have to say, I really enjoy. This is Sue Yu. An American lawyer said that when she was younger, people urged her to become a lawyer because of her name, which she thinks may have helped her decision. And as I mentioned earlier on, my own name, Mel, partially led me into a study of Islam because Melissa means slave of Jesus. I wondered why Islam also used a similar name for Jesus, Isa. So there you have it. Now, where this becomes significant is in terms of Ilyas. Ilyas is the Arabic form of Elijah. Why is that significant? Malachi chapter 4, verse 5 to 6 says the following: Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes, and he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction. So you can see how Ilyas, his name is Elijah, and how this fits in with the idea of him thinking of himself as a prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. Remember, we mentioned earlier on about this idea that he thought that the world was about to end and that he was the precursor for the Messiah. Did Muhammad imagine that he was some sort of Elijah figure due to his name? Had he an Elijah complex? And another interesting detail is you notice the word strike there, because we discussed a few videos ago about the meaning of Mecca. And the actual word in Hebrew is wahik-ke-keti, if I'm not destroying the Hebrew language, and it means and strike. The Strong's Hebrew says in its concordance that one alternative for that word strike is Mecca. So perhaps the word Mecca or Makkah might come from this term. So if you think about it, if there's a reference here to Elijah and there's a reference to Mecca in the same passage, maybe this is where the importance of Mecca as a place name came into its own. Just an idea I'm throwing out there. Now, the Mishnah says the following, that Elijah will come to settle all disputes and reconcile all discrepancies in the holy books. In that passage quoted there of the Mishnah, Discussion ensues as to what Elijah will accomplish. At the end of the passage, it says, quote, "The sages say Elijah will come to make peace in the world, as it is said," and then follows a quote from Malachi's passage that we mentioned just a few moments ago. This is why the Jewish reaction to the claim of prophethood in Doctrina Jacobi is so withering. He is false, for the prophets do not come armed with a sword. Truly they are works of anarchy being committed today. There is no truth to be found in the so-called prophet, only the shedding of men's blood. He says also that he has the keys of paradise, which is incredible. So essentially, the Jewish reaction to the claim that Muhammad or Ilyas is a prophet is dismissed by Jews because the sages say that the prophet Elijah would be one who makes peace, and Ilyas is coming with a sword. I hope everyone's seeing that. It's a bit like people in America are referring to the peaceful protesters, despite the fact that they are rioting in the streets. You know, it's preposterous. So here we can see the idea that Ilyas could be Elijah is dismissed by the Jews because it says, you know, the Mishnah insists in its conclusion that the prophet must be one of peace. Okay? So, however, despite that dismissal by the Jews, there was scope for Ilyas to assume that Elijah was meant to use force and that he had a divine mission to use force, because if we look elsewhere in that Mishnah passage, Rabbi Joshua said, "I have received a tradition from Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai, who heard it from his teacher, and his teacher heard it from his teacher, as a halakha given to Moses from Sinai, that Elijah will not come to pronounce unclean or to pronounce clean, to put away or to bring near," and quote, "but to put away those brought near by force and to bring near those put away by force." Do you see the point? So potentially Ilyas, who, if we think back, Sebios says that Ilyas was an expert in Mosaic law, then clearly he would realize that Elijah could be someone associated with force. I don't know if you want to chime in on that.
Yeah, I mean, if he knew this material and if he was a well-versed in this, he could have misappropriated this and taken this as his dictum. I would suggest that maybe it had much more to do with his need to control and have an authority and give himself credibility. But at the same time, he would take on he would be the subject of these prophecies. So he's probably using both his bets. He's probably saying, listen, I want to take over, and since I am a king, since I do have this power, let's go ahead and do that. But at the same time, I want to be the one who is the subject of these prophecies that of this man who's yet to come.
Yeah, well, you know, it's very convenient for him to have this passage because he can claim a divine right to use force, and you know, it's a mission from God, and God is on my side. You know, and it's always been a very powerful argument to make. Because who can disagree with God, you know? So if you argue that God has given you a mission, that you are essentially an Elijah figure, you're preparing the world for the end of the world, and that the Messiah is about to come, then you can use this as part of your ideological argument for why people should support you and get on board and not oppose you.
So what you're saying is really he's taking on the Elijah figure. He's doing that because that would give him a credibility. But at the same time, he's then zeroing in on this Mishnah from Edoyot 8:7 and saying, however, the modus operandi that I do so is to use force. So he's pulling the two together and say, I am the subject of both of these. Not only am I the one who then introduces the end of times, but I'm also the one who does so by use of force, and I've given authority to do so because it is how do you argue with God himself? God had given me this authority. Okay.
And actually, so what he's actually doing as well, if you can read between the lines, he's basically saying, okay, the Mishnah has this option, which is the idea that Elijah can use force. But the rabbis have dismissed this option. They've considered it, and after careful consideration said, no, the real Elijah figure must not use force. It must be a person of peace. So he's basically attempting to overrule the Jewish conclusion on this. The highest Jewish authority, which is, as just to remind ourselves, is to be found in those academies in Iraq, in what was formerly Babylon. So that this is what we're talking about here when we talk about the Mishnah. So he's basically overruling these Jewish leaders, which are found in the same land that he is the king of. So he's coming up toe to toe with the Jewish leaders in his own land here by going against this. So it's quite interesting how all of this pulls together. So what does Iyas actually mean? So Iyas is an Arabic name for boys that means replacement, restitution, something given in place of something else, and figuratively it means gift from God. And if you look at any websites to do with boys' names in Arabic, you'll find this. But actually, if you delve a little bit deeper, Iyas is the same as Ilyas, and Ilyas in Hebrew is Eliyahu, or Elijah. And that Eliyahu is particularly very interesting, because Eliyahu literally means my God is Yahweh. How about that, Jay?
Oh, goodness. Oh, goodness. So this comes around to nip him in the bud.
This literally is hugely embarrassing. Now, you know, a lot of people in the comment section who maybe have disputed my claim that Muhammad was originally called Iyas, and they say, well, why would they forget this name? Why hide it? Why change his name to Muhammad and give actually not only his name, but actually create a complete fictional biography with fictional parents' names and so on, going back many generations? Why would they do that? Well, the reason is because you can't have a prophet who is claiming Yahweh as his God in his actual name. It just does not fit. So you've got to get rid of this Elijah name. You have to hide this over. And so there was, as we, you know, probably come back to it later, but, you know, in Abbasid times, when they do refer to Iyas in the historical record, they make it appear that Iyas was on the opposing side to Muhammad, because they don't want people to know of this connection. They can't completely delete him from history, but they have to pretend he's someone else, because this is so embarrassing to
just
the
so
Islamic
people
tradition.
realize, and we need to remind people that in an earlier episode, you did talk about the fact that Iyas's nickname is Muhammad.
Yes, yeah.
So they've thrown out the formal name and now are using the nickname Muhammad. Look at myself. My nickname is Jay. That's not my real name. I'm not going to tell you what my real name is, because I have to be careful with that. But my nickname that I use all over the world and that I'm known by is nothing more than the name that is the popular name that everybody uses. It's what I use on the internet. It's what I use when I travel. It's used when I do my lectures. It's what I've used since I was, in fact, it was given to me when I was first born, because there was another person with my name in the hospital. They didn't want us to get us two babies mixed up. And so that's why they gave me Jay as my nickname. So in the same token, you can see here, Muhammad was the one that was appropriated, was given to him. They took the nickname and made that the common name, made that the popular name, and also made it the authoritative name.
Yep. So just to continue then, this may be a chief reason why Muhammad's original name has been covered up. The Umayyads and the Abbasids didn't want their founder's name to have any association with Yahweh. It directly contradicts the Shahada that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. If you think about it, it's hugely embarrassing that Iyas's name actually means my God is Yahweh. So it contradicts the Shahada, the most important. Like here we go again. It's one of the 5 pillars of Islam being destroyed through Iyas's actual name. It's very damaging indeed.
Oh, boy. So you've kind of come through the back door. That's fascinating. Well done, Mel.
So in conclusion, Muhammad's real name gives us a reason why he thought he was a prophet armed with a sword, and his name is a direct contradiction of the Shahada. The Shahada says the only God is Allah, but his name proclaims Yahweh. So I just remember from our times in Speaker's Corner, remember when you were on the ladder shouting, Yahweh, Yahweh.
But because even even the word name Allahu Akbar just means he is the greater. We would always put it to Yahweh, Huwa al-Akbar. You may have the greater, but Yahweh, he is the greatest. And so we would do it. Listen, you've done a great job here. And this is probably a hugely important talk that you've just given. Not only are you showing that this person, Ilyas, from Tayaye, up north, up in what is today Iraq, that this character is a historical character. He seemed to have a function, and he seemed to have taken that function very seriously. And there are references to him. Ishoab 6:59 kind of gives that, kind of introduces him as he's the bishop. He sees this problem here. He wants to protect his people. He uses irony. He uses sarcasm to support, to suggest what is happening, but to also to give them to give them assurance. But then you go, and what I love to do is that nomen est omen, that your name takes on your significance. Your name is what is important because you kind of fulfill that which your name suggests. And in this case, you have Ilyas, who has a name that, as you're coming out the very end, is the wrong one, because Ilyas is another name for Elijah, which is another name for the God. My God is Yahweh. My God is Elijah. Yah at the very end is Yahweh, and that's the name that is given to God there in Exodus 3, verse 14 and 15. Given by God to Moses before he went down to Egypt to bring out the Israelites. So here you have a real problem. It's a dilemma for those who want to now introduce Muhammad, or in this case, Ilyas. They cannot use Ilyas because that name is the reference to the God who is in the Bible, and that God who's in the Bible is the Son of God, who his name is Jesus Christ, and you cannot have that God because that's your biggest competition are the Byzantine Christians, who are the only other superpower, and they want to eradicate that idea that Jesus is God, and Ilyas would be too close to that. They sublimate that and they introduce Muhammad, which is his nickname, as we've seen earlier. That is his nickname. They elevate that one because the praised one, as we first have been hearing from where this was introduced probably on the Dome of the Rock and on the coins back in the 7th century.
Yeah, I just want to say, this name is kryptonite to Islam, because not only have we got the wrong God, but if you look at the historical record as well, is the fact that he was saying that the world was going to end and that he was the precursor to the Messiah, and that never happened. And that makes him a false prophet and a failed prophet. It's very destructive. Once you think about it, and I encourage Muslims to really think about it, take all this evidence here. There's been an attempt to cover up the fact that here is someone who thought he was a prophet, but he was a false prophet and a failed prophet. And that's really important that you grasp the significance of this.
Well done. For those of you who are watching, can you see what Mel has done here? Mel has he's followed the evidences on the ground. We've always asked people to do this. We've asked Muslims to do this. Mel's doing it since they are refused to do it. So go back to the 7th century, go back to even earlier in this case, come up to the 7th century, including the 8th century, see what's happening on the ground, and notice that this character did exist. Ilyas, he was from much further north, up in the Iraqi area. He did have power. He was an authority. He kind of fulfilled his name, but the problem with him is that this name, precursing back to this idea of him being Elijah, that would not only eradicate his authority amongst the people there, it would also say that he was introducing the end of time. Since that didn't happen, you've got to then, practically speaking, give him his nickname. The nickname, which would be the one that was then introduced by the Abbasids, became the one that stuck. And I assume what you're saying, Mel, is you can follow this sequence, even the sequence you're following through. It makes sense up from the Umayyad period up into the Abbasid period. When they now incorporated this character, they've got to also make sure that they incorporate what is theological significance. You cannot have any theological significance pointing back to Yahweh of the Bible, or of the Byzantine Christianity, of that supposedly tritheism. So therefore, you've got to make sure that name is eradicated, not only from practical purposes, but theological reasoning. Yeah. And that's why Muhammad then stuck.
And also, even where they have to admit that he was the ruler of Hira, they have to present him as the opposite side of the battle. They have to present him as going up against General Khalid, instead of actually both of them being on the same side, which is probably more likely, And even when they attempt to make a story around that, it doesn't hold together very well. It seems very unlikely and implausible. So they haven't done a really good job of covering it up. And if someone like me can work this out, then, you know, it makes me wonder how many other people have actually worked this out in Iraq and haven't publicized it because they're afraid to. There must be more than me that has realized this, you know.
Well, I think, Mel, what you're doing, you probably aren't very many people, because not many people are actually doing what you're doing. You're rather a rarity, and that's why you're a breath of fresh air for many of us who are historians, because you're doing what all historians should do. Go back, find the evidence, follow it, come up with your theories, put it out there as a white paper, and then get responses back. We want people to now do that. Listen to what Mel has said here about Ilyas from TIA. Look and see what he's saying about whether or not he has taken on to himself the mantle of an Elijah figure, and see himself as an Elijah character, coming out with that type of the same type of ministry that Elijah have, but then creating and seeing that those who then take on that and then incorporate it into the later traditions realize that you can't have that name. You've got to use another name, because that one has Yahweh's name in it. You cannot have anything to do with Yahweh, and that's why they've gone and they've chosen to use the name Muhammad. If this is so, then Mel, you've uncovered a real rock here, and this is going to cause an awful lot of, I'm sure, remonstration, probably some backlash from the Muslims who are listening to this. Do remonstrate. Feel free to backlash. That's one of the nice things about YouTube. You have the right to do so. Mel will be watching your comments. He'll be responding to as best he can. And we'll go from there, because we're just putting together more and more evidence after evidence after evidence. I love what you've done with prayer. I've loved what you've done with the Ramadan. I love what you've done with the word Mecca. I've loved what you've done now with the name Muhammad itself. And here's another nail in the coffin that we're finally starting to nail down. It's been great having you here, Mel. It's been terrific to do these episodes with you. I'm sure there's many more as you continue to unlock many of these books and many of these writings, many of these articles, many of these rock inscriptions. Everything you're looking at seems to be bringing out a little bit more of how Islam has borrowed ideas, has borrowed characters, has even borrowed names, has borrowed places, and has redressed it, takes the form and puts it into a completely new meaning. And the meaning they put onto it has historical antecedents. And when you look at those historical antecedents, it's not the same person, nor the same place, nor the same person, nor the same environment, and certainly not the same time. Well done. This is good to be able to unpack it. Now let's see how people then respond to it. Okay, then. Here it is. Mel and Jay. You in Europe, me in the United States. Over and out.